Hey students, this is Mr. Moore. I'm here with your AP European History notes for week 17. And these will be the last notes we'll have for the first semester. Week 18, there is no notes. It's finals week. So I'm not going to try to teach you any new content, but really just make sure we review the content that we've attempted to learn during this first semester. And it's important that we have these notes and talk about the catastrophic changes, both good and bad, that happened during the 1800s. These notes are entitled 19th Century Global Revolutions. It's important for every AP European history student to remember that during the 1800s, the label that we put on that century is the Industrial Revolution. So everything that I talk about in these notes today, you have to put it into the context or the frame of the Industrial Revolution. And today I'm not going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, but you have to remember that that's an ongoing process that started in Great Britain and then spread around the globe during the 19th century. What I'm going to talk about more today are political revolutions, and we're going to rewind the clock a little bit, remind ourselves of what happened in the French Revolution, and see how those ideas spread across Europe and across the continent of North and South America. And eventually, those ideas are going to spread all over, whether there's actual revolution or just political changes that happen. We cannot ignore the ramifications of the French Revolution. And so, how or why did revolutionary ideas spread and affect society across the globe is really the question we're going to try to answer. But I'll review one more time. We have to remember that during the 19th century or 1800s, there's this overarching idea of the Industrial Revolution that we talked about last week. So again, I'm not going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, but we have to remember that's something that's going on and affecting Europe and eventually the rest of the world during the 1800s. 1815 is a really significant date in the history of Europe. That is the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Remember that the French Revolution started in 1789. And for about 10 years, there was blood and carnage and chaos in France, to the point where the people wanted to get back to normal life, right? Sometimes people in 2020, they're like, oh, I can't wait for this pandemic to end and for life to get back to normal. But imagine living in France in the end of the 1700s when the guillotine is chopping off tens of thousands of heads and governments are being replaced one after the other. And you go from a king like Louis the 16th, who's an absolute monarch and is going to get his head chopped off, to be replaced by Maximilian Robespierre. You remember that guy? Who acted just like a king or worse. And then eventually we're going to end up with Napoleon, who crowns himself emperor in the early 1800s. And by 1815, Napoleon is finally conquered. And that's significant that we remember that, because that's one of those really benchmark dates in a European history class. In the history of the world, 1815, the end of Napoleon. Remember, after his trouble in Russia, he went back to France with a really significantly reduced military, his Grand Army, and then he was exiled to Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean. He escaped Elba for 100-ish days, and he tried to retake France and then rebuild his army, which 100 days is not enough to do that, and he ends up being defeated at Waterloo and exiled. What you need to remember by looking at this map is what we're looking at. Remember that because of Napoleon, during the early parts of the Napoleonic Wars, the French armies had gone into the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, there's a part of the Napoleonic Wars that are referred to as the Peninsular Wars. Okay? And the French army conquers the Spanish crown, and Napoleon puts his brother on the crown, if you remember. but this greatly weakens the Spanish government. And at this time, by the early 1800s, Spain owns or controls most of the Americas. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Because the Spanish government loses some credibility in Europe and has some problems because of Napoleon, they're going to lose most of their overseas empire in the early 1800s. Parts of the Americas are going to break free and gain their independence. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about places like Mexico. I'm talking about places like Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina. I mean, we're talking about almost the entirety of the Americas breaking free, and Napoleon's going to kind of usher all of that in. Napoleon also dismantles the old Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was weakened in the 30 Years' War, right? 1648, the biggest war to happen on the continent of Europe before Napoleon. So it was slowly been losing its power and its influence. And by 1815, the Holy Roman Empire has been completely dismantled. And in its place, two pieces of the Holy Roman Empire have slowly been growing out of the Holy Roman Empire since the end of the 30 Years' War. Prussia and Austria, and they really become their own political entities. Prussia is going to unite Germany into a country at the end of the 1800s, 1870s. And of course, Austria is going to go through a political and name change. It's going to call itself Austria-Hungary, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you can see that the Ottoman Empire still exists, and Russia is really starting to be a force to be reckoned with. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. So remember, we're rewinding the clock back to the French Revolution. One more time, the French Revolution started with an absolute monarch, Louis XVI. He and his wife get their heads chopped off. This is the simple version. They're replaced by the Committee of Public Safety. I got my air quotes going on. And of course, Maximilien Robespierre, who acts like a king or worse. And then, of course, by the end of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte comes in and, in a coup d'etat, in a military overthrow, takes over the government of France and crowns himself emperor. By 1815, when Napoleon is finally defeated and exiled a second time, the monarchs of Europe work together to restore the crown to the rightful family of France. Now, this is where you might want to pause and you might want to say, why would other monarchs, even if they don't like France, why would they help restore the monarchy in France? Remember how scary it would be for kings, monarchs, in countries around France during the Revolution. How scary would that be if you saw a king in another country right next door be dragged out of his palace and had his head chopped off and his wife's head chopped off and even his children imprisoned? So during the French Revolution, there was coalitions of European countries that were ganging up on France and trying to stop France from having a successful revolution. Monarchs didn't want the French Revolution to be successful. And so after Napoleon is defeated, remember Napoleon was trying to spread the best parts of the French Revolution across the continent of Europe. And so the other European monarchs, they restored the rightful heir to the French throne, and they called him Louis XVIII. So Louis XVIII takes over after the French Revolution and Napoleon is done. We go right back to where we started. I guess that's the irony. This is one of the reasons I put this little cyclical pattern up here in the corner to remind us that we started with a king, Louis XVI, ended up with a guy who acted like a king, right? Maximilien Robespierre. Then we ended up with an emperor. It's the same thing as a king, right? Napoleon crowns himself emperor. There's no difference between that and a king. And then in the end, we end up with another Louis, right? This time it's Louis XVIII. Now, if you're a real AP European history student, I hope you're asking the question, hey, Mr. Moore, what happened to Louis the 17th? Because Louis the 16th got his head chopped off in the Revolution, and now we have Louis the 18th. What happened to Louis the 17th? It's a great question. The answer is that Louis the 16th kid, who should have been the king, but was taken, captive during the French Revolution and basically, died of mistreatment and abuse and, starvation or, sickness during the French Revolution, was never became king. And so out of respect, they skipped 17. And so Louis the 18th becomes the monarch. He was the brother of Louis the 16th who had his head chopped off. So he's going to reign as a constitutional monarchy till he passes away. And France is back where it started. I kind of laugh, but it's not funny. It kind of makes us question, were all those deaths a waste? Very frustrating for people who wanted democracy and republic, right? That idea. After Louis the 18th, his brother, right? So Charles the 10th is the next monarch. He is also the brother of Louis the 16th. So two of Louis the 16th's brothers become the king of France. And by the 1830s, the people of France are frustrated again. Even though they have a constitutional monarchy, people have not forgot what it tastes like to be a respected country and what it tastes like to be a republic, right? And people haven't forgot about the ideas of the French Revolution. And so in 1830, there is a second French Revolution. This one is often referred to as the July Revolution, okay? And it oversaw King Charles X, okay? Again, Louis the 18th and Charles X are both brothers of Louis the 16th, who got his head chopped off in the French Revolution. Now, when we think about this second French Revolution, think about the movie or the book or the TV series or the musical of Les Miserables. If you're familiar with the book by Victor Hugo or all of the productions that have been done based on that story, then you kind of get an idea of what the Revolution of 1830 is all about. Think about students in the streets with building barricades. That's the image that should be conjured in your mind. The first French Revolution back in 1789, that's the one with the guillotine and the reign of terror and the heads being chopped off. There is blood that happens in any revolution, but we don't really think of the guillotine as much. That's definitely the first French Revolution. He was also the brother of Louis the 16th, as has been mentioned, and this revolution is the one that ends the House of Bourbon. So Charles X is deposed, but he doesn't get his head chopped off, right? It's not that kind of a revolution. He just has to leave France. And the people of France are going to, I guess in a sense, reboot the monarchy. They're going to go with a different family. And so they bring in a guy named Louis Philippe. It's sometimes called the July monarchy. I've got my air quotes going here. It's a constitutional monarchy. And Louis Philippe runs France from the Second French Revolution, 1830, all the way until the Revolution of 48. So, up and coming, there is a third French Revolution. Now, I hinted at this a couple weeks ago when we talked about the French Revolution, right? The original French Revolution. The problem is, again, we started out with an absolute monarch, Louis XVI. We had this Committee of Public Safety during the French Revolution, Reign of Terror, Maximilien Robespierre, right? Acted like a king or worse. Then we got Napoleon, who's an emperor, same thing as a king, right? Only to be replaced by Louis XVIII and then his brother Charles X. And then the people reboot the monarchy again, but we're still going around and around in a circle, almost like the French Revolutions. That's why people sometimes say it wasn't successful. Now, ultimately, most people who are, patriotic towards France would say that the revolution was the most significant thing to happen because the ramifications go on for centuries. Okay, but Louis Philippe, he's in power for almost 2 decades. right in the middle of the 1800s, and he's definitely a constitutional monarch. However, again, people are frustrated and they still have a monarchy. And people still have that taste of the French Revolution in their blood. And so there is a third French Revolution, and this one's called the February Revolution. This third revolution in 1848 saw the beginning of the Second French Republic. The first French Republic was back in, the 1790s during the original French Revolution, right? And it starts a wave of liberal revolutions that sweep across the continents that year. By liberal, I mean heading towards a republican form of government, as in a republic. Not to be confused by the sides of the political spectrum when we say conservative and liberal, but we are going to use those definitions this week. And you have to understand that goes back to some notes we gave a couple weeks before where we talked about political development and political evolution. 1848 is a date you've got to highlight in your notes. It's a wave of revolution starting in France and spreading across the continent. And it's going to affect almost every European country. It's not going to affect Russia or Great Britain. Those ones are kind of on the fringe, the edges of Europe, but it's going to affect almost everything in between. Here's the sad part, maybe the ironic part. During the Revolution of 1848, there is the nephew of Napoleon, who his name is Louis Napoleon, and he is going to be voted in as president of the Second Republic. And shortly thereafter, he is going to crown himself Emperor of France. He's going to call himself Napoleon III. If you're wondering what happened to Napoleon II, same kind of story. Napoleon, the original Napoleon, was ousted from power, and his son should have been Napoleon II. So this Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon, the original Napoleon Bonaparte, he calls himself Napoleon III. And first he's president, but then he soon becomes the Emperor of France. So if you're wondering again about this little cycle in the corner, you can see how it's just going around in loops. Now we're back to another Napoleon. Now, he's not the military genius of the first Napoleon, Napoleon Bonaparte, but he is going to have a significant influence on France during the middle of the 1800s. This story doesn't end here. France in 2020, right now in 2020, France is on its fifth republic. I was just telling you about this is the Second Republic, this third revolution. So after Napoleon III is done in the 1870s, they're going to institute the Third Republic. And then after World War II and the being overtaken by the Nazis, they're going to instigate a Fourth Republic. And that's going to fall apart during decolonization. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but in France today, they're on the Fifth Republic. So this cycle is not quite done yet. If you have questions about this, I truly hope you bring them to class so that I can help you dissect this information and really understand France after Napoleon and the original French Revolution. For those of you who live in California or who have a Mexican heritage, you're probably familiar with Cinco de Mayo. It is not the independence of Mexico. Rather, it is a ragtag, highly outnumbered Mexican military force that tries to resist a French invasion when Napoleon III was the Emperor of France. So back in the 1860s, when Napoleon III was in charge of France, he was trying to spread French influence around the globe and saw an opportunity to have a huge impact on Mexico, kind of get their fingers into North America. And Mexican army, highly outnumbered, again, really bravely, resisted Napoleon III's invasion of Mexico, and that's why people in Mexico or of Hispanic heritage from Mexico celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Remember, California, the state of California in the United States, was a part of Mexico and had just barely joined the United States by 1860. So that's why a lot of people in California are familiar with Cinco de Mayo, and it has to do with a French invasion of Mexico during the 1860s under Napoleon III. Now, from 1815 to 1848, the dates are right here at the top. Sometimes people refer to this as the Age of Metternich. If you've never heard of Metternich, let's just help you to see what's happening in between that time period. Napoleon Bonaparte spread liberal ideas from the French Revolution across Europe until he was defeated and exiled. So there's the key word: liberal, progressive values, moving away from the status quo. Okay? Now, the Congress of Vienna was held by major European powers to push a conservative agenda, to try to, in effect, rewind the clock and pretend like the French Revolution never happened. Remember, conservative is traditional and liberal is progressive. So the monarchs of Europe wanted to go back to the time when they were in charge before the French Revolution. They want to hearken back to a glorious golden age where they had all the power. However, liberal ideas were trying to, push freedom of the press and freedom of the speech and those Enlightenment ideas, right? And so the Congress of Vienna is a way for European monarchs to try to stop progress, to try to go back to the way it was before the French Revolution, to push a conservative agenda. And this guy, Clemens von Metternich, and that's the short version of his name, he was a nobleman and a diplomat and a foreign minister of Austria. He was not the leader of Austria, but he was a foreign minister, and he plays a major role in the Congress of Vienna. He's one of those guys who wants to bring it back to a more conservative across the continent of Europe, because Napoleon in the French Revolution was spreading liberal ideas. And so from 1815, at the end of Napoleon, until the revolutions of 48, Europe kind of takes a step to the right, going conservative. Metternich helped to orchestrate a concert of Europe, yes, pun intended, that was adopted by conservative forces to maintain their power. So if I ask you on a test, who's a conservative power in the 1800s, you got to tell me monarchs, people who liked monarchy. Nobles, right? Aristocrats. Who liked liberal ideas? Well, commoners or the bourgeoisie, those who were not given title, right? Not of the noble classes. Okay? Huge class struggles during the 1800s. The major conservative powers, that's the monarchs, the nobles, opposed revolutionary movements. And this concert of Europe, this Congress of Vienna, was meant to reestablish a balance of power. Remember that word, balance of power? France was out of control in the 1800s, taking over everything. And everybody had to gang up or form a coalition to stop France. And they realized that if one country got too powerful, the rest of them were going to suffer. So if it looked like Russia was getting a little too strong, everybody gang up on Russia. Even if you didn't like Russia, or even if you liked them and you were, with them in one war, it was okay to change sides as long as you kept the balance of power in check. Metternich helped to craft a sort of lasting peace in Europe that lasts from 1815 until just about World War I. There are some wars that happen in Europe from Napoleon to World War I, but they're minor compared to the Napoleonic Wars in World War I. So we will talk about, like, the Crimean War comes to mind, or the Franco-Prussian War comes to mind. So there is definitely military conflict in Europe in between Napoleon and World War One, but it's not huge grand scale. Okay, so there's a relative peace. Now we have to remember that during the 1800s, we're talking about this time period during the Industrial Revolution. So last week I talked about the concept and ideas of the Industrial Revolution and what that means. And this week I'm kind of laying out some events and other concepts that happened during the Industrial Revolution that have nothing to do with factories, or mass production, but more political ideological changes. Last week, when we talked about the Industrial Revolution, we did talk about sanitation and sewer treatments in major cities. One of the cities that was really just drowning in sewage and medieval problems was Paris. Under Napoleon III, he hires an architect to come in and just revamp Paris. Paris is considered one of the architectural and cultural capitals of the world in the modern world. And really, it is because of the renovations that happened, massive public works, okay, during Napoleon III's life. Haussmann, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. I'm not a French speaker, but Haussmann is the guy who came in, hired by Napoleon III, and helped to renovate Paris. So if you ever walk the streets of Paris, like the Champs-Élysées, and you've walked around Paris, it's beautiful and it's wonderful. And it really has a lot to do with this whole urbanization projects that were happening during the Industrial Revolution, including sewer systems that helped clean up the streets, prevent disease, and make it a beautiful city instead of a stinky cesspool like it would have been during medieval times, right? Here's some of the key ideas and terms from the 19th century. We've used the word conservative now. The 19th century conservative politics, that's different than conservative values today. Remember, conservative and liberal values will change over time, but one thing that stays constant is tradition. Conservatives like to hearken back to the past. So in the 19th century or 1800s, this means referring to monarchy or the old regimes or the rule of the nobles. So when people were trying to have a conservative push, like Metternich or the Congress of Vienna, Vienna is the capital of Austria, right? And that's where Metternich was from. They're trying to go back to the days when the kings ruled everything. Now, liberal, right? In today's politics, liberal, it still means progress. And even back in the 18th century, that's the one thing that still is like an overarching idea, right? So 19th century liberal politics is not the same thing as today, but still it's going against the status quo. So that would be moving towards a republic, going against the ruling powers that have been in control. Okay, and that's what we're talking about. Okay, so liberal and conservative are still terms we use today, and the underlying concept is still the same. During the middle of the 1800s, as I discussed last week, there was a movement, especially because of the Industrial Revolution, where capitalism was going unchecked and people were, good old-fashioned greed was taking over. And the people who were working in the factories were getting jack squat, and the factory owners were becoming bajillionaires. And so there was a movement to try to even the playing field. And this concept is called communism or radical socialism. Or sometimes people just refer to it as Marxism because Karl Marx was one of the chief authors of the Communist Manifesto. So if people say Marxist, they mean communist. If they say socialist, they're probably heading towards communist. Okay, there are differences, but it's more radical socialism. That is, the government's going to try to even the playing field, even though in the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx said there was no need for government, right? The working class would revolt. And it's a reaction against capitalism and a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. Marx saw these people who were working to death in factories, and they were getting nothing, right? barely enough to survive. And he said they're not going to put up with this. The whole history of the world is a class struggle. The haves versus the have-nots. And the have-nots are way more of the population and always have been, and they're not going to put up with it. There's going to be revolution. Ironically, he writes his Communist Manifesto in 1848, that year of revolutions. It's a call to rise up and revolt and redistribute the means of production in society. Everybody's going to get an equal slice of the pie. Okay? Nationalism is something I'm going to spend an entire week. In fact, right when we get back from break and we start second semester, I have a whole week lecture on nationalism. So I'm not going to try to explain all of it here today, but it's definitely one of those 19th century terms. Think about patriotism, but even more so. People are willing to do things for their country if they have a sense of commitment to the nation as a whole. And people are willing to put down their lives for a flag, for a national identity. Some people, when they hear the national anthem of their country, they get stirred with emotions and they're willing to go and do things that they normally wouldn't do because of this pride that they have, this overzealous pride. Now, I think patriotism is good. It gives us a collective, we care about something, and it gives us a sense of belonging, but it can be taken overboard. In fact, we're going to see nationalism get taken way overboard in World War I and World War II. Okay? So nationalism can be good and bad. Patriotism can be good and bad. The good side is you're going to support your country and your leaders, and you're going to collectively care about your country and work towards a better, system and government. On the bad side, if you're too patriotic and you're not listening to reason, you might start doing bad things in the name of a country or leaders that really you shouldn't be following them. The Nazis is a classic example of nationalism going way too far. During the 1800s, European nations move away from exploration and colonization to full-on imperialism. So if we go back to 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, we know that Europeans were exploring the world, and they set up colonies during the 1600s. Maybe even some early missions, during the 1500s, but the 1600s we start to see colonization, like, the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock and the first Thanksgiving, or Jamestown in the early 1600s. And by the time we hit the 1700s, we've got, the 13 colonies in North America. But there's a lot more than 13 colonies, right? Those are just the ones that united and gained independence at the end of the 1700s, okay? So by the time of the 1800s, Europeans are going to collectively take over the world. And that process is called imperialism. Now, after we get back in second semester, I'm going to spend an entire week on imperialism as well. So I'm going to spend 1 week on nationalism and 1 week on imperialism. But I need you to kind of get this idea that these things overlay on top of each other. And the backdrop, again, is the Industrial Revolution. When a strong country takes over a weak one and controls it politically, economically, and culturally, that's what we call imperialism. And that's something that European powers are going to do around the globe. Just think about the British. They were the masters at imperialism. Remember that the Portuguese and the Spanish were the top dogs during the 15 and 1600s-ish, right? The Dutch were the best during the 1600s. But finally, when we get to say the 17 and 1800s, it's really the British and the French that come out on top. The red here is a map, you can go Google it yourself and check it out, but that's the territory that the British took over, at the height of their empire by the end of the 1800s, which is why English is such a dominant language in the world, because of what the British did. Now look at this map here. This is the world in the year 1900, right before World War I. And you can see in the key at the bottom, the European countries and the territories that they took over by the time we hit the end of the 1800s. You can see the light green on this map is the British. You can see the dark green is the Belgians. Little tiny Belgium has colonies, especially a huge one in the central part of Africa. The Dutch, that is the Netherlands, the other little country next door, has territory in Africa and and of course, little small pieces South America, Suriname, and Indonesia. You get places like even Denmark to this very day. They own Greenland, still to this very day in 2020, right? Now, the Spanish, here's the ironic part, is by the time that the Europeans are taking over the rest of the world, the Spanish are going to lose their overseas territory, along with most of the Portuguese territories are going to be lost in the early 1800s. So remember, from about Mexico down to Argentina, excluding Brazil, is mostly Spanish territory. And they're going to lose that territory during the 1800s. So that's what we're going to talk about for a few minutes, is Latin American countries winning their independence. After the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789, liberal ideas spread across Latin America. That is the Spanish parts of the America, right? Spanish-speaking parts. Remember that during the Napoleonic Wars, as I talked about earlier in the notes, the Peninsular Wars, Napoleon weakened Spain. He actually took over Spain and put his brother on the throne. And Spanish military, even though they were defeated by the French armies, they used guerrilla warfare tactics to try to keep, some sort of control over their territory. There was like a constant fighting going on the Iberian Peninsula. Okay. And so the Spanish colonies in the Americas, colonies like Mexico and Argentina and Chile and Bolivia and Colombia and Guatemala and Costa Rica, they're going to see an opportunity for independence. They're going to see this as a chance to break free and become a country like the United States. Remember, the United States, just a few years or a couple decades before this, gained their independence from Great Britain. And so they're like, it's possible. So the Spanish speaking parts of Latin America, remember, Spanish is a Latin-based language. Just to pause for a minute, Latin was the language of the Romans. On the planet Earth today, there are 5 languages that still speak a Latin-based languages. They're called the Romance languages. Romance as in Roman. So Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and French are the ones you probably have heard of. And there's also Romanian. Think about that. Romance, Roman, right? Those are the 5 Latin-based languages that are still used, the significant ones on the planet Earth. So that's why we sometimes call people Latin American or Latinos, because they speak a Latin-based language. So the Spanish-speaking parts of the Americas win their independence as the Spanish Empire is collapsing. Mexico is one of the first to go. Mexico won independence from Spain in 1810. But the economic disparity kept the country internally divided for almost a century. In fact, if you're familiar with Mexican history, you'll know that there was a Mexican Revolution in 1910, just a few years before World War I, and it does affect the United States. Okay? So Mexico is going to gain its independence just a couple decades after the United States gained its independence. But the United States was more economically successful and militarily successful. In fact, the United States is going to take a giant chunk of Mexico during a war that includes areas, like California and Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado and Nevada, once Texas is annexed, which Texas, of course, was also a part of Mexico. Most of the Latin American revolutions of the 1800s were not as successful as the U.S. example. So that begs us to ask why. Why was the United States more successful than, say, Mexico or Bolivia or Colombia? And there's lots of things to consider and talk about. And honestly, next year you're going to take a U.S. history class, so I don't even know if we could fully answer that question right here. But what we're going to do is continue to look at American revolutions that happened in the Latin speaking parts, right? Kind of talked about what the 5 Latin based Romance languages are. Probably the most famous of the Latin American revolutionaries was a guy named Simon Bolivar or Simon Bolivar. He is sometimes called the Liberator, right? El Libertador. He's the guy who's going to lead South American countries to independence. Not all of them, but a huge chunk of them. He lived, obviously, right. He was ruling and living right during the French revolutions, right after the American Revolution. There's stories of this guy, Simon Bolivar, actually meeting George Washington. He was educated over in Europe, spent time in France, during parts of the French Revolution, and was instilled with Enlightenment ideas. And he came back to South America and he really tried to help initiate freedom to a certain extent. But here's the problem. In the Spanish colonies in the Americas, there was a real social structure, and it's different than in the British colonies that we call the United States today. And so this is maybe one of the reasons why it wasn't so successful, is because of the deeply rooted social structure in Latin American colonies. Okay, there's a group of people called peninsulares. Those were Europeans who were actually born in Europe but lived in the Spanish colonies. And so they were the highest status because they were full-blooded Europeans, white, right? And so when they came to the colonies, they're the ones who ran the colonies. There was a group, a social structured group of people called Creoles. And in this case, when I say Creole, I mean those who are full-blooded Europeans, but they were born in the colonies. So their heritage is European, but they've never lived in Europe. Or maybe they lived in Europe, but they weren't born in Europe. They were born in the Americas. Okay? There is the next rung down are the mestizos. And those are people who are mixed blood. They're part European blood and part Native American blood. If you look at like the population of Mexico, something like 85% of Mexicans are mestizo. They're a mix of European and native blood. They have like maybe Maya or Aztec or Olmec blood, right? Native blood in them, but they also have European blood in them, right? They're a mixed race, the mestizos. Below that would be the mulattoes. And mulatto is a word that's it's very derogatory. We don't use it anymore, but it's a word that's written in historical documents to describe those of African and European mix. So obviously Africans who were brought over from Africa to work in plantation systems sometimes would intermarry or intermix. And those children who were half white and half black were called mulatto. At the very bottom of the pile would have been the full black, the slaves, or those Indians who weren't mixed at all with European blood. And so that's one of the problems in a lot of Latin America is this social structure doesn't unite the people, and so there tends to be internal conflict for a long time. Simon Bolivar, okay, in the early 1800s, he helped win independence. Okay, he's like a Creole who's born in the Americas, but he's 100% European blood. And he goes and gets an education in Europe. And like I said, even traveled in the United States. And when he goes back home, he's going to raise up in rebellion against the Spanish government, especially after Napoleon had weakened the Spanish government during the Napoleonic Wars. And he's going to help like the modern day countries of Venezuela and Colombia and Panama and Ecuador and Peru. And there's even a country named after Simon Bolivar. Down in South America, there's a country called Bolivia, literally named after Simon Bolivar. He was educated in Spain, spent time in France and the US, as I've just mentioned. He brought Enlightenment ideas to Latin America, and he formed a republic in South America called Gran Colombia. He's a hero to the people of South America. He's a statesman. He became like the president of Gran Colombia. He's a military leader and a politician. Okay? I sometimes like to think that he's like the George Washington of South America. He's not quite as cool as George Washington. Of course, I'm an American, and I would say that. Um, he's not quite as. And George Washington just did some amazing things when he was president. So, um, but Simon Bolivar, every seems like every Spanish-speaking country I've been to, I've seen statues of Simon Bolivar. Like, even if you go to Mexico, Simon Bolivar had nothing to do with Mexican independence, but they still have statues of him there because he's one of those Spanish speaking heroes. Simon Bolivar. Statues all over the Spanish speaking parts of the Americas. Here's a map of Gran Colombia in 1830. And you might say, well, that's not very big of a country. It's not as big as, like, say, the United States. But remember, in 1830, our country wasn't very big either. Remember, the country boundaries of the United States stopped at the Mississippi River until the Louisiana Purchase during the Napoleonic Wars. In the 1830s, we were barely just realizing what was out west, and people were going out on covered wagons, Wild West days. So our country was not from sea to shining sea in 1830. It was very small. These were the only states, okay? Florida was annexed on to the United States in the early 1800s. Texas is going to become a country first and then a state. And of course, we're going to fight a giant war with Mexico and gain the territory that we live in here in California. And we're going to, slowly work our way all the way and create the continental United States. But remember, Gran Colombia is not much different than the United States at the time, so pretty significant. The other giant chunk of South America we have to pay attention to is Brazil. But remember, Brazil is Portuguese, not Spanish. So the story there is a little different. Portuguese royalty moved to Brazil during the Napoleonic Wars. They knew that Napoleon was coming. And so some of them bailed from Portugal and moved to Brazil. In fact, Brazil kind of became Portugal, like literally. And it was almost like Portugal back in Europe was like second place. It's almost like Brazil became Portugal because all the royalty moved because they were getting away from the Napoleonic Wars. And so some of those royalty who had moved to Brazil instigated a revolution against Portugal and become, what we think of as the country of Brazil today. And of course, economically and population-wise, it's the powerhouse in South America. And you can see early 1800s. There's also a revolution that happens in Haiti. It's something that's a really unique situation. And when we're in class, I try to do some activities talking about the revolution in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution happens during the French Revolution and during Napoleon's reign. It was a slave revolt. So the revolution in Haiti is unique in all the history of the world because it's really the only time that a slave revolt turned into a country where the slaves actually overthrew their masters and formed their own country. It was a French colony of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean, and during the French Revolution, there was a guy named Toussaint Louverture. This is the only slave revolt that resulted in the formation of a country, which still exists today. After the revolution, mulattoes, this mixed African and European blood, they ruled the country. And the Republic of Haiti was born in 1804. But it suffered from years of poverty and isolation. In fact, today, unfortunately, Haiti is the poorest country in North and South America. Out of all of North and South America, Haiti is the most financially ruined, and it's got corruption and problems. It's not a nice place, and that's kind of because it was isolated. It starts off as a good story, but maybe it's a tragic ending. The ending's not there yet. It's still a country. But Toussaint Louverture was a slave. He was, he helped raise a rebellion, a slave rebellion, and ended up helping to create the country, the modern day country of Haiti. Anyways, if we're in class, I like to do a lot more talking about this. happens right during the French Revolution. Maybe spend more time on Toussaint Louverture, but I think this will suffice along with the textbook reading. Let's look at those revolutions of 48. Remember that in the year 1848, we get the Third French Revolution, right? The first one is in 1789. That's the original French Revolution, followed by Napoleon. Then in the 1830, we get the July Revolution, right? The Les Miserables, barricades in the streets. By 1848, we get the third revolutionary cycle in France, a series of political upheavals that spread across the continents. Britain and Russia are not affected by this wave of revolution. A revolution is going to happen in Russia, but that's not going to happen until the early 1900s. Okay. I'd have to do the math, but we're talking, something like 70 years later is when the revolution is going to hit Russia. Still along the same ideas of class struggle, conservative versus, liberal ideologies. There were 6 factors that kind of led to this wave of revolutions. Widespread dissatisfaction with political leadership. Think about that in the modern days, right? In the year 2020, people are dissatisfied with political leadership. Could we have revolution again? Questions that historians ask themselves. Demand for more participation in government and democracy, right? Getting away from the old order of having monarchs control everything. Demands for freedom of the press. I know this is a history class, but some of these things just bite us in the real world and beg us to ask those questions that maybe still are not answered. Demands of the working class. Because of the Industrial Revolution, people were being taken advantage of. Remember, 1848 is also the year that, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels write this Communist Manifesto, trying to combat capitalism, unchecked capitalism, okay, because they witnessed things firsthand. The rise of nationalism, people feeling this patriotism towards their country, and if they didn't have a country, wanting one, wanting to be free and independent, to make their own choices, to be a sovereign nation, and the regrouping of social classes. So the revolutions of 48 happened, 150 years ago, 170 years ago. But we're still asking some of these questions today, and that's why they're relevant. Now, these revolutions did not result in immediate change, but maybe in long-term changes. This is a little map showing you where there was major conflict during the revolutions of 48. We can see, of course, it starts in France. There's some in Italy. There's some in the Austrian Empire. There's some in Prussia, all across the continent of Europe. But it's not going to make it as far as Great Britain. They have a constitutional monarchy and a lot of stability. And of course, Russia. Not at this point. It's going to happen later. The last thing we're going to talk about, these ideas, these revolutionary changes, do affect the art of the time. And the revolutionary change that happens is something called Romanticism. There is also something called realism, but it's not quite as revolutionary as, say, Romanticism. There are 2 very different artistic movements that reflect some of the ideas of 19th century Europe. So Romanticism, when people think about romantic, they think about love. Oh, I love you. But that's not what I mean when I say romantic. What I do mean is an over-exaggeration of the truth, or seeing things in its perfect or idealistic way. So sometimes people do see love in a romantic way, this idealistic, unrealistic thing. But there's also romanticism in what people look like and how things work. So romanticism places more importance on emotions over reason. Remember, the Enlightenment was all about reason. So in a way, romanticism is a reaction against the Enlightenment. It's also a reaction against the mechanical, factory, mass production of the Industrial Revolution. Okay? It's an artistic and literary movement. And of course, it's a rejection of rational thinking. putting emotions above logic, okay, and fighting against the dehumanization of industrialization. So if you romanticize war, that doesn't mean, oh, I love war. It means you see war as heroic and awesome and cool because you've got this built up in your head because you've watched movies or read books about war and it seems glorious and cool until you get out there in the battlefield and you see your buddy's guts spilled out and he's crying and dying, and that's real life. So romanticism is the opposite of real life. Real life is realism. So it rejects the exotic ideas of the romantics and focuses on common everyday events and people. If you see somebody out in the field cutting hay or wheat, that's realism. If you see some mom, breastfeeding a baby in a train, that's a famous painting. That's real. That's realism. Romanticism, would be like the picture of George Washington on the front of a boat crossing the Delaware. It didn't look like that. It didn't look like that at all. That's romantic art. Realism is dull and plain, but real. These ideas, born in revolution, start to change the social fabric of Europe during the 1800s. Revolutionary ideas shaped and molded the arts and culture and entertainment and literature of the 1800s. So what is this? Is this romantic art or is this realism? I hope that you can tell. This is definitely realism, right? Women out in the field, okay, working. That's what it really looked like to live during the 1800s, okay? The Romantic period is an intellectual movement, maybe even starts before the French Revolution and bleeds into this Industrial Revolution era, okay? It's an embellishment of reality. It's the idealistic. This movement in Europe was in part a reaction to the Enlightenment that focused on logic and reason. And this movement is also a revolt against the aristocracy and the rigid social norms of the time. And of course, the dehumanization of the Industrial Revolution. The Romantic period favors emotions and aesthetics over scientific rationalization of the Enlightenment era. So emotions over reason. That whole idea where they're like, that guy's bad for you. Oh, but I love him. Yeah, but he treats you like a jerk. Oh, but I love him. Like you're choosing emotions over logic. That's romantic. Okay? Over time, ideas from this era gave way to liberalism and nationalism in Europe. Here's a famous painting by Delacroix, early 1800s. This is depicting a scene from the Greek War of Independence. This is not what it looked like. This is a romanticized picture of war. And you might say, well, how is war romantic? Remember, we don't mean romantic as in I love you, but an idealistic, over dramatization, unrealistic, emotions over logic. That's romanticism. Now, as always, I have a ton of courses on like the revolutions of 1848, of the Latin American revolutions, right? We got all kinds of videos on romanticism, romantic art, all kinds of videos to help you learn. Remember, the point of these notes is to help you learn the content. Thank you for being with me. This is the last notes of the first semester. This is week 17. Next week in week 18, we are reviewing for a final. Thanks for being with me. We'll talk to you guys soon.